Hi, good afternoon. I'm Jaylenore Bressler, and welcome to the February 23rd, 2019 edition of the Bible Delight in the Details as we continue our story of Joseph. When last we left Joseph, he had been falsely accused of sexually attacking his employer's wife, and he had been thrown into the political prisoners prison of the king. That very fact pays testament to the fact that his employer may not have been 100% convinced of what his wife said. It was a feeble story and very circumstantial evidence anyway, and it ran so counter to Joseph's character that one kind of is left with the idea that his employer, who there's indications had started to think of him almost as a son, was not convinced, and yet felt, perhaps just to keep peace in the household, that he had to get rid of Joseph. So what did he do? Excuse me. I think he may have done the best he could by Joseph by putting him in the palace prison. This would have certainly been a step up from whatever the common punishment was, and who knows, maybe he had an idea that someday, maybe, perhaps, kind of like Brother Reuben had an idea, he might be able to rescue Joseph at a later time. Of course, he never did, but God had another plan. You can imagine Joseph, falsely accused, feeling that possibly he could have felt that God had abandoned him, and yet we know from later statements that he made when he was reconciled with his brothers, that he saw God's hand, excuse me, in everything that he had suffered. But I want you to consider something. You know that in Genesis chapter 40 and 41, we have the stories of what happened to Joseph in the prison. Namely, he was made the personal attendant of two very important men who were at that point on the outs with the Pharaoh. That was the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. Now, particularly the chief cupbearer was really a right-hand person to the Pharaoh, and therefore would have been constantly in the Pharaoh's presence. You remember the two men had dreams. Joseph interpreted them for them. The cupbearer, he said, was going to be returned to his post. The baker was going to be executed, and indeed that came to pass. What you may not remember is that there was actually a discussion between the cupbearer and Joseph that the cupbearer was going to plead on behalf of Joseph. He was going to remember Joseph if and when he was indeed returned to favor. But there is no indication that he ever opened his mouth for over 2 years. Now, I want you to think about that. Joseph has done this guy a great favor. He gave him hope. He encouraged him, said that God had given him this message. He had done, great things for this guy through God's through God's providence, and all he was asking for was to have his cause pled before Pharaoh, and yet the guy didn't do that for over 2 years at least. Think of Joseph day after day, every moment, thinking he was going to receive word from the cupbearer and never receiving anything. What a betrayal that must have felt like. And again, it was certainly would have felt a betrayal by the cupbearer, but Joseph, for whatever reason, never felt that it was a betrayal by God. I say good for him. But that's hard. That's very hard, but good for him. Now, interestingly, though, of course, eventually Pharaoh had a problem. Pharaoh had these weird dreams about cows, and we're going to talk tomorrow about how really weird that dream was. I think because we've heard it all our lives in Sunday school, we skip over how very psychedelic weird that dream was. But we'll talk about that tomorrow. But when the king could not decipher it, that is when the cupbearer talked to the Pharaoh about Joseph and said, there is someone who can interpret dreams. And then Joseph was called by a command performance to Pharaoh. Excuse me. Now, the reason I bring this up is because a lot of times we think that God needs to be on our time schedule. And when God doesn't act quickly, or what we could deem quickly, we get very put out with him. But listen to this. If that cupbearer, if God had allowed that cupbearer to go and plead on behalf of Joseph at the time Joseph thought was appropriate, the only way Joseph would have been seen by that Pharaoh was just a foreign slave who may or may not have been falsely accused of a very heinous crime. And, even if the Pharaoh had said, yeah, I don't think he ought to be in prison, where would Pharaoh have gone? I mean, where would Joseph have gone? Where would he have wound up? He'd have been out on the streets. God knows what would have happened to him. But God, in the providence of time, made it so that when Joseph was seen by that same Pharaoh, that Pharaoh needed him. And therefore, Joseph was seen in a completely different light. And I believe it was the way that he was presented at that time, that allowed him to be seen for what he was, and therefore was recompensed for that, and had the opportunity to become second in the land to Pharaoh. Let us remember that. Let us remember that sometimes what appears to be a quick salvation, a quick deliverance, is not always the best deliverance. But only God knows that. And we may know it in retrospect, as Joseph clearly did. Join me for more of the Joseph story on the next edition of the Bible, Delight in the Details. Have a great day.